Welcome to the next podcast of Millinery.Info. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie. Thank you for joining me today. This episode is with Laura del Villaggio. Laura is the designer and milliner behind the label Milli Starr, with her studio located in Austin, Texas. She's an active member and serving on the board of the Milliners Guild. She's also a teacher in her local community and these days also in the virtual teaching community. We hope you enjoy this episode with Laura. Thank you to our wonderful podcast sponsors, Be Unique Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House for Dawn, Lifted Millinery, Hat Mags, and we'd like to welcome Hat Language as our new podcast sponsor. You can find a link to each of their businesses in our show notes. You can find that in your podcast app or through our website. If you've been enjoying listening to this podcast series, I'd love to invite you to show your support through becoming a Patreon. We have 2 tiers, either a podcast sponsor or supporter. You can find out more or sign up to these tiers at www.patreon.com/millinery.info. We'd really appreciate your support if you're able to show it in this way. I hope you enjoy this episode with Laura. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining me today on the Millinery.Info podcast. It's wonderful to have you with us. I'd love to start with, how did you first get involved with millinery?
It's been a long journey, but I would say that it began with a love for vintage clothing. So I started collecting and wearing hats when I was like 12 or 13 years old. I started hitting the thrift stores and shopping secondhand. And of course, some of the best things I was finding happened to be vintage. And I wear a very small size, so I could fit into those little 1920s cloches and little 30s kind of Garbo fedoras, and started building up quite the hat collection and wore them almost daily, even as like a student in high school. So it started there with, just collecting and wearing hats. And then in 1997, I went off to New York to graduate school specifically for a program, basically in fashion history. It was museum studies for costume and textiles. It was a master's program. And in doing all my research for programs, I discovered that the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where I was for grad school, also offered millinery. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the very few certificate programs in the U.S., even now, 20 plus years on. So I had the 2-year graduate program in the fashion history within a museum context. And the millinery program was 2 years. So I got special permission to take both at once. Oh, so the millinery was an elective. It was just because I loved hats and I was curious about how they were made. And I knew it was an opportunity I didn't want to miss out on. So I did a lot of research and prep work for the museum stuff and made hats. And I got hooked, absolutely. And I never really intended to, I wasn't doing it thinking I'm going to be a milliner one day. I remember we had to write like a short couple sentence professional statement as we were finishing up the certificate in millinery. I was like, I don't think I'm really going to do this, but it might be fun to do some historical millinery for film or theater sometime. I thought I would kind of combine the two that way maybe, but I really at that time was still set on finding a curatorial position, which never materialized for a lot of reasons. And I kept making hats. I was able to get kind of the core components of my millinery studio in 1999 as I finished school and moved from New York to San Francisco. A steamer and about 5 hat blocks and like a wig head and a spinner and just the basics from someone who was retiring. And it was the early days of eBay. So I think I won one auction. I was like, do you have anything else? And she sent me a list and we did it all by like check and mail. And yeah, that would have been 1999. So yeah, so that's where it started. I missed the hat making once I left FIT and wanted to continue, even if it was just for fun on my own. So,
And did you go on, had you worked for anyone during that time when you were studying, or it was solely learning was within the course?
The learning was specifically within the course. It may have changed now. The program, of course, is still there. At the time, it was 4 semesters, 4 courses, and then an exam at the end, a competency exam. 3 of my 4 classes were with Janet Linville, who still teaches there. And she was an amazing instructor. She's very strict and very precise. And if you were like a millimeter off in your pattern drafting, it was a red mark and points off. But I learned really well, thanks to how strict Janet is and how wonderful a milliner she is within the theatrical world and as an instructor. So I consider, the 2 years at FIT to have been a really good foundation. And then after that, I just kept making. And my mom had taught me how to sew and do handwork like embroidery. So I was always, comfortable with the needle and strong, just always interested in fashion. My undergrad was a dual major between history and apparel design. So I had that background. And just making the hats, because I was in San Francisco for a couple years and then moved to Austin, Texas, which, certainly not in 2001, was not any kind of fashion center whatsoever. Not a lot of hats except for cowboy hats, which I don't make. It's just not my thing. And so I felt really isolated, and I just made hats and sort of carved out a niche market. I used to do a lot of bridal work. And then I started to see things really shift in the US market. Like 2010, 2011, 2012. 2011, I believe, was the royal wedding with Will and Kate. I think every customer for like the next 2 years wanted to talk about, Duchess Kate and her fascinators. But it made a huge difference in the American market. It was finally on the radar, and I didn't get a weird sort of blank look when I said I'm a milliner. More people kind of knew what that was. And then in 2012, I took the plunge and went full time. I gave up my last theater job. I was doing some costume design work and have done millinery full time since then. So it was a good decision.
And what type of work are you working solely with one-on-one clients, or do you have retailers that you stock to? How do you structure that?
It has changed a lot over the years. Right now, I don't have any stockists that I'm working with because, even though the lockdown hasn't been strict here, I mean, things are really open in Texas. It's quite strange. People just aren't out shopping. So I'm really glad I already had my online presence established. And I typically do a mix of custom orders and then things that I make, like small collections that I'll do, or just things I get inspired to make, and then it resonates with someone and they buy it, which is great. And I really need that creative balance in the years where I've been slamming busy with custom orders, for the Kentucky Derby and racing season here, spring weddings. I get a little burnt out because when you're working for a client, you're working as a designer. It's to go with the dress, to flatter their face shape and hair color and their style. And I always find I'm itching to just, play and make something that makes me happy, something I would wear, or, so I find I need that balance. And one of the positives of the slower season in 2020, with the cancellation or postponement of all the races and some weddings, and was that I have had more time and had enough custom orders and sales through my website to keep me busy, which has been a blessing to have that daily work.
Done. That's a lot of work to establish that, but then for it to be also returning for you and keeping that flow of income coming through is really important. Well done.
Yeah, it's always been, I've always had to. When I registered my DBA, which is my doing business as, like tax paperwork and all that official stuff, shortly thereafter, I was a single mom with a 3-year-old, and, I did alterations. I worked part-time at a vintage store owned by a friend and tried to make and sell as many hats as I could, because it literally meant, paying the rent and having grocery money. So, I've always built my business to turn to profit. So there's always that pressure, like, who is going to buy this hat?
And when
who is the customer?
When a customer comes to you, you have stock. So when someone's looking for maybe a custom piece, are they picking from stock you already have and you're adapting, or do a lot of them walk in with a kind of an idea of this is exactly what I want and you're making from their concept, or how does that process work between you and your customer?
It's definitely a collaborative process. I've never kept a ton of inventory on hand because I feel like hats are so individual. That's why I was drawn to them in the first place. It was a way to look different than everybody else. And so, not everyone's going to be the same size or not going to be the same color, different brim widths. So I don't keep a lot on hand. So when, a custom client walks in and let's say needs a hat to wear to a wedding in Scotland or something, then usually we start with the dress. And I take measurements and we look at swatches, and it really starts from scratch. And I do sketches and then multiple fittings through the process. So it really is that, kind of traditional bespoke process. And customers really appreciate that. I think they enjoy seeing how it all comes together. And it's much easier to have a custom hat made than it is a custom dress. It's less expensive and prohibitive maybe, and tends to be a faster process. So I think it's really accessible, little window into that world of custom fashion.
And one of the questions I want to ask you, because you have such an interesting background, is museum studies. Is that the correct title?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you think that that kind of knowledge influences the type of millinery and styles you make?
I think there's definitely an influence in my aesthetic when I am making, kind of the things that really appeal to me. I'm working with my vintage hat blocks and often, vintage trims or vintage hat bodies. I like a simplicity and elegance in my designs. I'm not one to over trim. I like, either minimalist or just enough. I don't think a hat should overwhelm the wearer. I think there should be a balance head to toe. And just because you're going to the Kentucky Derby doesn't mean you need a hat that's 4 feet across. That's not what I do. I'll still them to another milliner who does that style if that's really what they want. But so there's that aesthetic, that vintage inspiration that I pull from. I also have a ton of textile expertise because of the textile chemistry and all the dyeing and supplementary weave structures, and I know my textiles really well, so I know how they're going to behave both under steam, on a block, and a dye bath. I think that really helps. The other thing I discovered, it kind of occurred to me one day, was that because of my couple of semesters training in textile conservation, all of my tools are much smaller than other milliners use. So I use small scissors. I use really fine gauge needles and pins. I used curved surgical needles, which are fabulous for sewing through all the layers you get with millinery. But that's one of my go-to tools. And those are all things that I worked with doing textile conservation work. So there's the tools. And I guess one of the other things is that I'm always conscious about how things are going to last over time. In fact, it's kind of in the tagline for my business, which is bespoken and beloved. And that beloved, I hope that, it's around and treasured and cherished for decades, that, someone's granddaughter may find the hat and go, oh my gosh, this is fabulous. And it'll continue to be worn through time. I think a good hat never really goes out of style. If it's been made well and, it doesn't ever really go out of style. And then I also try not to do anything in making a hat that can't be reversed. So I don't use glues, and that's part of the whole sort of textile conservation training too.
It's really interesting how that influences. And you mentioned in your brand there, that is Milli Starr. How did you come up with that as your brand name?
When I first registered my paperwork for business, it was Milli Hats and Headwear. And then shortly thereafter, I became aware that, there was like Milli dresses, and I wanted to differentiate from that. Milli is short for millinery, of course. And Starr, I just thought was rather auspicious. And I think I did a lot of astronomy classes in college. I actually was really good at math and science, but just didn't go that direction with any of my studies. I still love looking at the stars. So yeah, I thought it sounded kind of fun and positive. And Janet Linville, my instructor, had said, "Don't ever use your own name for your business." She had some reasons for doing that. And that advice, although I know it's far less common within the fashion world to not design under your name. But anyway, that was one of the reasons too, was following her advice.
And so much experience to follow along there too. So she's definitely got a wealth of knowledge to be drawing on for her advice. So your studio space, could you tell us a little bit about that? So it's in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, I'm in Austin, Texas, which is kind of in the middle of Texas, about 3 hours south of Dallas. And it is most known for probably South by Southwest. The Music and Film Festival really put us on the map. And then ACL Fest is a big music festival that usually happens in the fall. But we get a lot of tourists in Austin. It's a college town that grew, and it was one that I've left twice and moved back twice. And I don't know, thinking about moving on now that my daughter's out of high school and in college. We'll see. I do miss a big city, but my studio has always been in my home. In other years, I've had a retail or office space for meeting customers, but the mess stays here. And one reason was so that I was home and available for my daughter to, she'd be sitting across from me doing homework and I'm sitting here sewing. It worked out well. And then I do put in, depending on the season, it's, 18-hour days sewing. So I really did need to be at home, but I have about a 300 square foot space. I think my favorite things are probably, I've got really good lighting, which has gotten more important as I've gotten older and my eyes have gotten older. And I have this wonderful 6 foot by 8 foot table. It's a production table from an old sewing factory. So it's a great height and sturdy, and I can spread out the mess all over that. And then the rest of it's pretty organized, shelvings with blocks, and I like to keep all my ribbons and trims in like clear plastic bins so I can see. I tend to design by color just to kind of start narrowing it down immediately, or the decision making can be really tough. And then I've got a cinema closet. I've got a wonderful little closet under the stairs that I keep cinema and straw cloth and buntles, things that are more prone to light fading in the closet, so they're in the dark most of the time. And then a whole other space that is shipping and photography and all that extra stuff, inventory. Yeah. But I'm lucky I do have the space at home to spread out and work. And I did teach group classes here in my studio at home with up to 4 or 5 students around my big table. Yeah, I miss that.
Is that something you're going to hopefully be able to do again soon? Are you looking forward to, will you be teaching again?
I am. I really am. I miss my students. I have ones that have been, taking classes with me for years. I've taught it's over a decade. It may be going on 12 years now. And I teach private classes. I've had people come in to Austin from as far away as like Brazil, a lot of Canadians, Mexico, all over the US to take classes, either, a few like really focus days or a full week, and then group classes. And even though I've done some teaching on Zoom, as many of us are, I really miss that energy of people gathering in a room and doing something creative, and that chatter around a table as women sew. I miss that. It's just not the same when everyone's on the screen. It's great. The accessibility is amazing. I have had students log in from, Nigeria. I've logged into classes in London or Australia. I mean, that's fabulous, but I do miss the in-person.
Absolutely. And I know we're in was going to say exceptional circumstances, unusual times, but what does a day or a week in your business look like for you?
Lately, I've been trying to wake up early so the house is still quiet, because one of the big changes is I went from basically working at home by myself and everybody else is off at school and work, and it was quiet for at least 12 hours a day to everyone being here, which is different. So I've been trying to wake up really early. So I've got a couple of quiet hours to get my coffee, check my email, check social media, and then dive into whatever orders I need to be working on that day. I do tend to sort of compartmentalize my workflow so that I'll have a day that's all blocking. So the steamer's hot all day and I do all my blocking, and then they'll dry overnight, and then I'll start doing wiring and work on that. And then everything kind of goes through to the trimming stage. What that means is often I've got a lot of hats sitting on the blocks waiting to be finished, because the blocking is absolutely my favorite thing to do. And so, it might not always be the most efficient than, a milliner who blocks and finishes start to finish without any other distractions around them. But I also read books the same way. I've got 3 going right now. So, yeah. I like to jump around with my projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's one of your favorite projects that you've been working on recently?
I've just started a really fun commission that I can't share much about yet, but I'll definitely, it'll be fun. It's inspired by a 60s film, a special commission. Let's see. I've always enjoyed working with my derby customers, and many of them, go year after year. And so, I've made their hats for every year for the past decade, and you just get to know people really well. And I enjoy being part of their stories, because when you're doing special occasion millinery for the races or weddings, it's something special in their world, and they're really planning for it. And the hat's part of those memories. Like, I'm really aware that clothing has sentimental value. Like, we'll associate a dress that we wore to this party where something special happened, or, clothing has those memories and sentimentality to it. So I really enjoy being part of their stories. And I think one of the coolest things that happened was I have a client who lives in Texas but has a horse farm in Kentucky. And shortly after working with her the first time, she bought a new filly and named it Milli Starr. So there's now a racehorse named Milli Starr, and she's won a few races. So every once in a while I'll check in and see how the other Millie's doing. But that was such an honor. It was just bowled over, that she would do that. But she loves my work and thought it was a great name. So
That's
yeah, there's a racehorse. Yeah, so that was really cool. But yeah, being part of people's stories, and I've gotten to know some amazing people within the fashion industry here, through the Milliners Guild in New York. I've been a member of that for about 11 years, just wrapping up my 3-year tenure as secretary. So, it's an amazing community. It has grown so much. It's been really interesting to see, particularly the changes in the millinery industry in the U.S. since I did my training 22 years ago. It really felt like a dead and dying art at that moment in the late 90s. And there's been such a resurgence in interest. It's really great.
It's amazing. What do you think have been some of the key factors in the resurgence?
I think in general, there's been a renewed interest in handwork and craftsmanship and sort of those heritage brands that have been around a long time. Kind of as a backlash against the fast fashion. And that's been lovely to see. I think people are looking for creative outlets on their own. So many people are curious and they take a class. Again, access to classes is so much better than it was 20 years ago. The ability to learn millinery is fairly accessible with just a Google search. And that's, I remember when we were all trying to shop from catalogs and by phone. So being able to order online is fabulous. I think, historically, when the economy is down, accessory sales are up. Lipstick sales go up too, but accessories in general, because it's much more economical to buy a new hat or a belt or shoes than it is the dress. So I think that's played into it a little bit too.
Very interesting, yeah. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about the Milliners Guild there. Could you tell us a little bit about the organisation and what's involved in being a member and how you got involved?
It was founded in around 2007 and then incorporated as like an official legal nonprofit around 2010, which is right around the time I joined. I think I was one of the first official out-of-staters. Most of our members, like all the founding members, were in the New York City area, and the majority of our membership is still in the northeastern United States. And I think part of that is because, New York City is the hub of, the garment district. It's the fashion industry in the U.S. And then the training program at FIT, which is churning out milliners, and there's several hat factories in the city still. Right now we have 55 members, somewhere around there. So we're a smaller group. We meet monthly on Zoom now, which has been fabulous for connecting everyone across the country, because we do have milliners, from across the U.S. now. And we do, online exhibitions now. We've done lots of gallery and museum exhibitions. In 2011, we did a runway presentation during New York Fashion Week. I flew up for that. That was really fun. So yeah, it's really beneficial. I enjoy being part of that community a lot. And they have a website if anyone's curious. There's how to join and what we do, and you can see examples of who our members are and what they're making. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So you've just had a 3-year term as secretary.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's fun. I mean, if it's anything, it's a time commitment, but it's also really rewarding. And I've enjoyed watching, the Guild grow over the past decade and being a part of it too.
And how have some of your approaches to how you produce millinery changed over the years?
One of the things that has been really nice in the past year or so is I kind of, before everything hit last spring, which would have been March for us, in January 2020, I set myself a sustainability goal for the year. And the overall sort of push to do that for me was to bring my business more into better alignment with my values. Because like I mentioned, I've always done thrifting and secondhand and been very conscious about some of the really ill effects of the fashion industry at large. And so my goal for the year was to try not to buy anything new, work with what I have on hand. If I'm buying something new, it's specifically because I need to reproduce something that's already on my website that's sold. So, I need that sale, or, to buy vintage. And the timing was actually great because it meant I didn't drop a bunch of money on supplies to prep for Derby, which ended up being canceled. But it's gone really well. And I'm continuing it again for this year where, I'm really thinking carefully about what I purchase for my business, looking and digging and seeing, oh yeah, I bought that, 5 years ago and never used it. I need to finally block that, even and moving a little bit away from, it's vintage, it's dead stock, I can never get another one. Well, it's not so precious that it shouldn't be used.
That's such an important approach.
I'm continuing with that and really enjoying it, and definitely have some customers now yeah, I definitely have some customers now who really appreciate that, the whole thing, is basically, totally sustainably produced, um, finished dead stock felt, finished dead stock ribbons. Yeah. And I'm there's a little bit more of a challenge in your sourcing, but I've gotten some gorgeous, gorgeous things that I've enjoyed working with.
So interesting. And how do you communicate that to your customers? Is it on your website, or you have you communicate, like you have a conversation with them?
It's a little of both. Yeah, I usually list it on my website, and yeah, for a while I was trying to always do things where I could at least make a few of them, to kind of offset the cost of a photo shoot with a model and makeup artist and hair and the photographer, and if it's a one of a kind, and it's cost you $150 just to photograph it, you've got to somehow build that into your overall cost. So I'd always have kind of limited edition, even when I pulled in some vintage stuff. And I've kind of moved away from that now that due to COVID, I'm shooting things on a mannequin head here with my lights and, good camera and everything. But it's opened up some more possibilities.
Absolutely. And
although I do really miss working with my team. I've had the same really wonderful team to help me do photographs for about 10 years. And the only thing that's ever changed is the models. And I had one model I worked with for about 7 years. So
it's fantastic.
I've been really lucky that way.
How often would you do a photography shoot?
About 3 times a year. Not a lot. It's a lot of work.
It is so much work. 3 times a year is quite a big number. And do you do it treat it as a seasonal collection, or you'll just photograph pieces that you have on hand? How do you decide what's going to be
usually a seasonal collection? Yeah, the newest stuff. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about your block collection. What does that look like? How many? Don't know. No, maybe you don't tell me a number. That's all right. What kind of pieces do you use most frequently? What are some of your favorites? And how did they come to you?
I imagine I've got somewhere probably around 200 blocks. I've got at least a dozen, balsa utility blocks, like studio blocks, in all the sizes. Those are kind of like the workhorse in my studio. Plus, when teaching, you need all the sizes. And then, there's always the basic, cartwheel brims and dome crowns you need. But my favorites are my puzzle blocks. And I've really built up quite the collection of vintage puzzle blocks. I just think they make the most wonderful, intriguing shapes and are easy to block. You don't have a big brim you've got to wire and deal with. Usually they're pretty small, and often that raw edge tucks under. And so they're fairly fast to make too. So I've got quite a few now. And I think my other favorite category is probably saucer hats. I think they're just fun and photograph so well, and have been a continual, good seller for me for probably about 7 or 8 years. So I get a lot of use out of my saucer blocks too. And I find a lot of them online, eBay, Etsy. I've been doing millinery long enough that my name is known. And so occasionally I'll also get just an email saying, so-and-so is retiring. They've got blocks. Do you want them? Or I'm culling my collection. Do you want first dibs? I'm like, yes, please.
Always.
You can never have too many blocks. There's always, I think there's really a thing called hat block envy that many milliners suffer from, right?
Absolutely, we do.
So I love the vintage ones. It also, blocks are kind of like our pattern library as milliners. And so with vintage blocks, I know that style or shape is unique to me and what I'm making. And then I've also started doing more custom send-off sketches. And for that, I usually work with either Guy Morse or Daryl at Hat Blocks Australia. I've got a lot of blocks from both of them who do good work.
Mm-hmm. Lovely.
Yeah, slowly but surely. I really started out with those 5, and was most definitely on quite the budget with my business. And, I started very small and only custom. And so, I'd get my deposit, it would cover the supplies that I needed. And then there'd be a little bit of profit, and some of that would go, into the bank, and some of it would go back into the business. And that's just what I've done over the years. And I really do feel incredibly blessed to have materials on hand and blocks around me at this point after 2 decades of doing this and starting so small and on such a shoestring. Absolutely. It's nice to have a drawer of felt hat bodies. It really is. And I'm quite aware of that I'm really lucky. And I know that I'm lucky to be able to spend every day, working in a studio with my hands. Yeah.
That was a perfect note. I thank you so much for being a part of our podcast, Laura. It was so lovely to talk about Milli Starr with you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Lauren. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Millinery.Info with Laura. I'd like to thank our Patreon podcast sponsors: Hat Language, Be Unique Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House of Adorn, Lifted Millinery, and Hat Mags. You can find a link to each of these businesses in our show notes. You can do that through your podcast app or through our website. We're really appreciative of their support of this podcast series, and we invite you to check out these amazing businesses. You or your business could show your support of Millinery.Info by becoming a Patreon. There are 2 tiers. You could choose to be a podcast sponsor, which means your business or event is mentioned in our podcast, a link included on the Millinery.Info website and in the monthly newsletter. This starts from just $15 per month. The other option is the supporter tier. This is from just $5. It's for those who would like to more quietly show their support, so we can keep producing the content you see and hear on Millinery.Info. If you have any questions about becoming a Patreon, I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, visit www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info to sign up. Thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie, and I look forward to talking hats with you again soon.